Saddle hunters, our brothers over at Tethered continue to kill the game by releasing innovative products. They just recently put out the Eberhard Series saddle. They also put out the Menace saddle, which is for our Husky brothers and sisters that are into saddle hunting. That saddle will do just maybe a little bit better job of cupping your quote unquote assets. But the thing that I'm most excited about is their recent release of the Tethered One climbing stick. This thing is crazy light, crazy strong, and crazy quiet. I'm just going to cut to the chase here and give you some specs. Each stick weighs in at less than 1 pound. That includes your Dynalite rope attachment. A 3-pack of these will weigh in at 2.7 pounds, which is ridiculously light. It's a 17-inch step-to-step single stick height, and there's an 8.5-inch step footbed, which gives you plenty of room for those of us folks with bigger feet. It's all made with aerospace grade titanium and aluminum for construction. So if you'd like to learn more about Tether's innovative products, head over to tetherednation.com and check them out. The first thing I do in the morning before a hunt, before a scout, or just before getting ready for work is have my morning coffee, and I'm sure most of you out there listening are the same. Make sure you're filling your mug with Skull Brew coffee, as it is the only coffee company that is both 2% for conservation certified and donates 10% of its profits to conservation organizations to help secure the future of our wild places. So head to skullbrewcoffee.com and choose between 3 killer roasts of coffee and know that you are supporting conservation with every sip. Welcome to the Truth from the Stand Deer Hunting Podcast, brought to you by Skull Brew Coffee Company. I'm your host, Clint Campbell, and you're listening to episode number 196. Today we are cranking up part number 2 of the Aggressive Bow Hunting Tactics Hunting Beast listener Q&A session with Dan Infalt. So stay tuned. All right. What is up, everyone? Happy Wednesday to you. Hope you are doing well. Hope you are feeling fine. And hot damn, the season is here. I opened up, as I'm recording this on Sunday, I opened up yesterday and got a chance to get into the timber. And wouldn't you know, as luck would have it, we have a nice little chilly cold front kind of rolling through. I won't say maybe a cold front, but we've had a nice change in temperature that's starting to feel a lot like fall. Maybe we'll put it that way. It was a brisk 41 degrees yesterday morning, 41, 43 degrees when I woke up yesterday morning. I actually didn't go out and hunt the morning because there's a particular deer that I wanted to try to kill, that I've mentioned in a previous podcast that I think I know where he's bedded. And just I just wasn't confident I could beat him back to bed, put it that way. And so I thought I would have better luck hunting the evening than I would the morning. And so that was my plan headed into yesterday. So I didn't hunt the morning. And this piece has some water access, so that was slick. It was a nice maiden voyage in the kayak. Made my way in. Pretty decent hike to get into this spot, which I kind of forgot because every time I've gotten to this place where I found where that deer was bedding, I've taken a roundabout way to get there because I was kind of scouting some other stuff. And so it never really dawned on me that from boat to setup area, was almost a mile. It was like 0.8 of a mile. So, and it's through some gnarly stuff. So it took me a while to get into where I wanted to set up. It was probably a good 45 minutes to an hour to get there, trying to go slow, trying to be quiet, of course, especially as I got closer to where, I thought he was bedding. But the moral of the story yesterday was it was a ground hunt. I was hoping to have a little bit of wind when I got in there to try to get into a tree for a little cover sound. But, all day I was outside kind of getting ready, and had some things to do outside before I left to go hunt. And it was nice and windy. And I'm thinking, man, this is perfect. If this wind will keep up, it'll give me enough cover sound to be able to climb into a tree, because I felt like where I wanted to set up, I might be able to actually get a vantage point into the area that he's bedding in and might actually be able to see him. But what you know is, like, as soon as I, get out of the boat and start hiking in, I mean, the wind just completely died and there was nothing. So I ended up hunting from the ground, had a good setup. But unfortunately, yesterday I ended up having to deal with just a little bit of pressure, and some things that kind of occurred during the hunt, that kind of made it less than ideal. I don't think the game is over in that spot necessarily, because it wasn't like, the pressure I was dealing with, it didn't blow deer out. It was just more of an inconvenience that I need to kind of think about how to get around. And really what it was just, someone who wasn't too far off, which I knew where they were going to be because I knew generally where their stand was at. They have a two stands in this general area that are lock on, so they're not moving. So that's always good because I know I can hunt around them and kind of use their pressure, their access to my advantage, which is what I was doing yesterday. But they were doing a lot of very loud blind calling yesterday. That was just kind of what I was presuming was probably going to keep deer movement to a minimum, especially this time of year, because I don't think deer are going to react favorably to it. I've not seen deer react favorably to it in general in Pennsylvania, rattling antlers and stuff like that. And for me personally, it's early in the game for those types of tactics, at least in my book. So, I sat and kind of, played out the sit. And then eventually I had a camera there that was set up over a scrape, and I wanted to see what inventory was hitting that as I was getting ready to call the hunt. And so I checked that, and the good news is that there is one of the two big deer. I couldn't tell because I forgot my card reader and I forgot an extra SD card, which is a rookie mistake. And I checked that camera and just used the viewfinder on the front of that camera, and was able to see. It looks like one of the two bigger deer that were in that area are hitting that scrape. So that was good news. And so that was kind of the hunt yesterday. Had a good entry, good exit. The hunt itself was a little less than ideal. I'm gonna have to kind of rethink how I approach hunting that general spot to try to avoid folks. And it might be one of those things where I need to pay more attention to that area maybe during the week and try to figure out how to get in there, not on Saturdays. And then maybe another general area on Saturdays whenever there's going to be some other folks in that general area. But all in all, super stoked that hunting season's here. That's kind of the name of the game here, at least hunting public land in Pennsylvania, is that you have a plan. And then usually pretty quickly your plan gets blown up, because you're sharing, these pieces with a lot of folks. Just driving by, there was a lot of pressure on a lot of pieces, which I kind of expected given that the weather was as nice as it was. Had a nice, cold day, brisk fall day. I truthfully kind of look for, this time of year, especially early in the season when I might have a deer that I think I know where he's at. I'm really looking for warmer temperatures because that'll keep folks out a lot of times, or just bad weather in general for these Saturday hunts. During the week, doesn't matter to me. But on weekends, it's like I usually like to have bad weather, whether that means it's rainy or whether that means it's abnormally hot, where people think deer movement's going to be less, so they stay out of the woods because the weather isn't good. I always kind of look for those days. But regardless, bow season is here, and I'm super stoked about that. And I'm going to try, I think, to get a couple morning hunts in a couple places where I think I could have some opportunities in the morning this week before work. So we'll see how those play out. But with that, we're going to keep this up front short today. Have the last episode of the Hunting Beast DIY, or the Hunting Beast listener Q&A podcast series. It's been killer having Dan on for these. I think it was 8 episodes. This is part number 2 of our aggressive bow hunting tactics session that we did with one of our fellow Beast members. Had a great conversation with these guys. This is an in-progress pickup of the part number 1. So if you haven't listened to part number 1, go back and listen to episode 194 to get this from the beginning. And with that, I hope everyone out there who has already had their opener, I hope you had good luck. If you haven't opened yet, hang on just a little longer. It's almost here. And then once you do hit the timber, I wish all of you the best of luck. As always, thank you all for listening. All right, so I think that's I think we wrapped that one up. I think we'll move on to the next question. He touches on something that I think we covered a little bit about, just like, beast hunting and how you have to adapt and stuff like that. But I think he's asking more of like a tactical question. So we'll go ahead and tee this one up. He says, after all the years that you've spent teaching, the beast style hunting to, new hunters and that are learning the style, what, in your opinion or in your experience, has been the hardest part of beast tactics for someone to pick up or to overcome? Is it learning bedding? Is it understanding thermals, or, not playing the wind correctly? From your perspective, what is that hardest part to kind of get right? Or maybe it's even the part that once you get right, things start to fall into place for you. So what are your thoughts on that?
No, I think it's getting to the point of belief and believing in the system. I mean, if you go in there and half-ass it and you don't believe in what you're doing, you don't have the confidence, really getting over the hump. I mean, I think a lot of guys go in and they go scouting in the spring, because we push that a lot. Mm-hmm. And they'll find some bedding area that's like textbook, right where we say it'll be, and it'll be just tore up with rubs and stuff. There'll be beds all over the place, heavy trail going on, easy setup, and they'll think, "Oh, I got it made." And they'll clear out a stand, and they'll think, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to kill that deer next year, no problem. And they go out there and they don't kill that deer, and they can't understand why. I mean, the bedding area was tore up, all that stuff. And what they got to realize is I hunt a spot like that just about every evening. I went all last year and didn't kill a deer.
Right.
No, that's not to say I didn't have opportunities, but you don't, those spots might look great and they don't always pan out. You can't just count on one of them. Sometimes they look excellent and the deer just aren't bedding there the time frames that you're hunting. Really getting down the timing of when deer bed in certain spots. And we touched on that earlier in this conversation. Mm-hmm. I think you brought it up, Clint, that you really, as you get better at this, you start to understand that there's a time frame mm-hmm. when deer use each bedding area. And even the primary bedding areas that they use all year, there's specific windows of 4 or 5 days a week when it's really got peak use with a more dominant buck. And once you get to know that stuff, you can start killing bucks out of those bedding areas year after year. And I've got several bedding areas where I've killed bucks for years. And I've got, and some bedding areas turn out to be kind of like a nursery. Mature bucks will only pick certain bedding areas to use. So they'll rotate through certain bedding areas. And that's not to say they never bed in some spots. But what you'll find out is some spots look good and they got a lot of beds, but it's all young bucks. I mean, you don't
right.
see one over 2 years old. And really getting the big picture down and understanding it is the big thing. And not overhunting the spots. The guy finds a good spot, finally kills a deer, beast style, and then he looks at the other spots. He's like, well, I don't have any other good spots. He just keeps going back to that spot. Now that spot was bad on him.
Right.
You can't overhunt those spots. If a guy doesn't have the timing thing down, I think what he needs to do is do throw a hunt at it early season, throw a hunt at it rut, throw a hunt at it late season. Don't hunt it any more than that, or you'll burn it out.
Right. That makes sense. I mean, Tim, as a person who is, what we'll refer to as, well, I guess you and I, beast disciples, if you will, right?
Yeah.
For you, as you were adopting this approach, I think it'd be interesting to get your perspective on, what were some of the challenges, or the hardest parts to grasp for you as you were kind of adopting this way of hunting.
So I was going to answer this a certain way until Dan talked about belief. Mm-hmm. And that makes a lot of sense to me. I'm a very, very methodical person. I have to kind of envision in my head. I have to kind of see the process unfold. I got to see how this is going to work. I think about logistics. I think about timing. I think about distance. I think about a lot of things when I'm going in. And when I started learning about mobile hunting and setting up a stand every single time and picking a new spot every single time, and some guys go 1 mile, some guys go 3 miles, it's like, how do I get a deer out? So I'm already thinking about all those different things. And I'm like, and you got to believe that you can do it. Mm-hmm. You got to believe that this can be done. And I think that's where it started for me. It's like when I decided to, start doing mobile and start, targeting specific deer and going, being a certain type of hunter instead of one that was, okay with going to the same stand every single time, mm-hmm. Sitting behind a bait pile. And there's, don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with that. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of hunters out there. There's nothing wrong with that though. But the knowing you can do it and to not be afraid, that was huge for me. Cause I hunt by myself a lot of the time. And I think just to, get that fear out of you a little bit of the unknown, mm-hmm. that, you just keep going. Up by us, a lot of guys, they're a little afraid of the predators, right? Mm-hmm. Cause you're back 2 miles and the wolves start howling. It's kind of a scary feeling, but you get used to it.
Right.
And so it's kind of one of those things. You just gotta, all these little things that are, all those excuses that are keeping you at home and keeping you from, becoming a better hunter. You got to believe and you got to keep going.
Yeah.
You got to get past that.
Yeah. I totally I totally agree with you. And it's the fear of, like, it could be anything, right? It's the fear of the unknown. It's the fear of not knowing what's going to happen next. And, I think for me tactically, like the two things for me, like once I started kind of getting over the hump was, one, reading maps. Like if I were going to be tactical about it, it was like understanding how maps are going to help me and being able to do my work, from, maps versus boots on the ground. Like once I got comfortable being able to understand what the land was going to kind of look like when I got there, before I got there, like that for me was a big hurdle. And then it was really like trusting and having that belief, like you said, in cutting the wind the right way to where it's like I was going to give the deer the wind. Like once I got comfortable in the idea of that, then I started kind of seeing even more of the results. But the one thing as you were talking, Tim, that I wrote down, and this might be a little bit of like hocus pocus, a little granola or hippie maybe even, but I wrote down, once I learned or began to value the experience more than the outcome, that's when it all started clicking for me. Like once I started valuing the process and not the outcome of the hunt, because you're going to come home 1% of the time with a tag filled. You know what I mean? Like that's for many people's hunts, because maybe they only can hunt weekends and they work and they take a trip or whatever the case is. I mean, most guys, it's probably a 1% chance. Like, and that's probably a pretty realistic number. And so if you get that out of your mind, that the only outcome that matters, the only thing that matters is like filling a tag. Once you remove that, and the value is in the process of learning and setting yourself up for success, then all of a sudden, like the things start clicking and you become less afraid of failing, all the stuff we talked about earlier. And you start seeing those small wins, Dan, like you talked about, that you're winning even when most people would look at you as failing, because like there's something to learn there. There's something to stack on top of the past experience to set you up for the next one. And so that's kind of the way I think about this style of hunting and what it's taught me and what it's meant to me. So.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, it was a little granola. Sorry, I got a little hippie there, but but no, I mean, it was truthfully like it took me a minute to kind of realize that, and once I did, I was like, this is why I'm starting to have success, because I'm valuing the right parts of it, So, and I think that's important
for me too. I saw when success wasn't the obsession anymore, hunting became a lot more fun.
Yeah,
and I mean, it's hard to say to a guy, because if a guy hasn't killed a buck, or he's only killed one or something or two good bucks, it's really hard to tell him, it doesn't matter if you kill a buck, because to him it does, because he's trying to prove something.
Right.
Once you get to the point where you got nothing to prove, and you really don't care what other people think, and if you don't want to shoot a buck, you do it because of what you feel instead of what you think other people will think of you.
Yeah.
You become a much better, more rounded hunter. And I've seen that with women a lot. Mm-hmm. Not to be stereotypical, but you see a lot of women that get into hunting because their husbands are in or whatever. Mm-hmm. And they out hunt their husbands because they really don't care if they shoot a big buck or whatever. They pass all the little ones, and they just go out and have fun, and it starts happening for them.
Yeah.
Where if you put too much pressure on yourself, I mean, I've seen guys, but they just fall to pieces when a big buck finally walks out, because they can't take the pressure, because they've been waiting for that moment for so long.
Mm-hmm.
Once that's over, and it's much better. Not to mention, I mean, if you're not used to seeing big bucks and stuff, or deer, you talk to these guys and they come out of the woods and they tell you, yeah, I saw a good buck go through over here, and blah blah blah, and you're like, well, which way was the wind going? I don't know.
Right.
What was this doing? What was they don't know anything. They don't even know exactly where the deer was. They're just staring at a deer they saw go past.
Right.
Where I'm using every moment I see like that as a learning experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. I think it's interesting that you point out like the idea of, the females will out hunt their, or their wives will out hunt their husbands and stuff like that. And I think there's like a lot of validity to that, because there's not a social construct at which they're trying to keep up with the Joneses in that arena. You know what I mean? It's like they're just out having a good time, having fun, and and they're
not
being
chest puffing.
Right. They're not trying to open their tailgate at Casey's. You know what I mean? To hang out with the deer hanging out there for everyone to drive by to see it. You know what I mean? Like that's not their game. They're out there to have a good time and relax, maybe, you know what I mean, enjoy the outdoors or whatever the case is. And because of that, they become a lot more receptive of what's going on around them. You know what I mean? Because you're open to it as opposed to like thinking yourself out of the opportunities, if that makes sense.
Right.
But all right, I think we answered that one pretty well. This next one is a really short one. Does the bump and dump really work? Dan, I think you're the perfect person to ask this question. So you, it's I've tried it. I will admit, I will say that I've tried it, and it damn near worked last year. Just the wrong deer showed back up. But you know, your perspective, like I want to get your answers, you know, straight on this one as far as like, does it work? And then, you know, beyond that, how are you executing something like this if you're going to try to make it work?
Okay. It's a complicated question because it works, but you got to take that with a grain of salt because, I mean, you get on cushy land, you know, where it's well managed and stuff. Deer don't get a lot of pressure. It works a hell of a lot better than it does on public or pressured land.
Mm-hmm.
With that said, I have bumped and dumped deer. I've never done it to a mature buck. I've never done it to a real good buck.
Mm-hmm.
I've done it to smaller bucks and not shot them. I've done it where I've gone in and kicked doe groups out and they've come back and I shot one.
Mm-hmm.
But I have done it with mature bucks and had it fail on several occasions. And usually it's because they come back sneaking, wired, you know, staring at the sky, you know, worried. I remember one time when it worked, and you get a kick out of this. There's a way to get into this one public woods where you get along this canal and you go way back, and then you spread out into the woods, and then you can go through that woods and get back to all these other areas. And I was hunting back in that area and trying the different bedding areas, like hunting an area down. But every time I went back there, I had to take this canal back there. And I walked on this canal the first day, and about a 140-inch buck jumps up from a bush, you know, that's kind of floating in an isolated water spot, stares at me a second and runs off. And I'm looking at that, I'm like, you know, I should almost get in here in the morning and hunt that spot. And I'm thinking, he ain't never coming back. Next day I go through there and that buck jumps up again. And I'm kicking myself thinking, I should have hunted her. He came back, you know. And the third day, I'm thinking I'm an idiot.
Right.
When he jumps up. And the fourth day, I wasted a morning there, and he didn't come back.
Nice.
You know, so I mean, you got to believe in it. You got to do it. I mean, my best success on that actually hasn't come from the next morning. It's come from the same day.
Really?
Kick a deer out of his bedding area, and if you soft bump them, a lot of times they trot off. And an hour and a half later, they come sneaking back. The trouble with it is they come in from downwind.
Right. Yeah.
I did it with the Rome Legend buck the year before I shot him. I jumped him out of a bedding area, and I split him with a doe. And I thought for sure he'd come back because the doe went one way and he went the other, and it was pre-rut. And he did, but he got downwind of me, blew and took off, and I'd have probably been better off if I hadn't set up there and I let him come back and get back into a routine and then tried to hunt him in the area again. Because then he got really hard to hunt. But I did it on an island one time. I went in to hunt, and this is more early season, and up jumps this monster and trots into the swamp. And I knew he didn't see me. I knew he didn't smell me. He just heard me coming through the grass, and he got buggy. And I thought there's a good opportunity there. So I got into a tree where he went into the swamp, and I sat there. And a couple hours later, he came in, and he got to 20 yards, and there was a thick bush in front of me. I think he just got some wind swirl or something, because all of a sudden he just blew and took off out of there.
Right. And
I had the wind in my favor, but it was probably like a little thermal draft when it got calm. He got or something and busted me.
Right.
But that's the thing. I mean, they come in and they try to catch some air current or wind or something, and they try to smell that it's safe before they come in. So I think the best way to make that scenario work, if you're going to do it the same day, is to really try to figure out how that deer is going to come in downwind and what he would do. if he was going to circle in there to make sure you're not there and hunt it downwind instead of hunting right over the top of it.
Right.
That's probably the number one thing. If you can do that, if you're going to do it in the morning, I mean, that's a tough gig too, but, maybe it works 1 out of 10 times. And then out of that 1 out of 10, when it happens, then you got to execute correctly too on a deer that's a little bit nervous about what happened the day before.
Right.
So I think it happens a lot less on public land. And the reason I say take that with a grain of salt is because I've been, pounding big bucks on public land my whole life, and I have not executed on a good deer yet.
Right.
And I've tried.
Right.
Tim, the only ones I know of that were killed on private, cushy land kind of thing,
Right. Tim, have you tried the old bump and dump? And if so, what was your net score on that?
No, I haven't had any experience with bumping the big one in the big woods.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if that's because, whether if I'm not setting up close enough to them or they're just not there a lot of the time. But I think it's situational, and you also got to read how what the deer does and where the deer's headed, what the wind's doing. And if you think you should set up where you think he's going to go, maybe backtrack a little bit, kind of like what Dan was saying. But you're going to do it the next day. You gotta think, what do you have to lose, right?
Yeah.
Where he was, right?
Yep.
You have that information, and if he's there, like Dan kicked that buck out 3 days in a row. Well, you won't know unless you try.
Right. Yeah.
So I wouldn't, to answer, this guy's question, does the bump and dump work? It's like, I guess, it depends, I guess, is how I'd answer that. I wouldn't say it's a yes or no thing.
Right. Yeah. I gave it the old college try twice this year. Both times were in Iowa, public land. And I jumped a big deer out of a drainage or out of a draw and some CRP. It was like a hedgerow in the middle of the CRP field where it was a low spot. Bumped him out of there. I didn't expect him to be there, or I should have. But when I was walking up on it, I realized too late that it was a great bedding opportunity. And he was looking at me as I was climbing glass on the other side of the CRP to make sure I wasn't going to, blow any deer out. Had the wind in my face, but he was also, looking that way because he was watching, downwind, or, he was watching his back trail. So he busted me and blew out of there. And so I ended up setting up in that bedding area, waiting for him to come back the next morning. And he never did. Had a small buck walk in, and that was it. And then the deer I ended up killing, it's like, I'm not taking credit for a bump and dump on that one because it was the next to last day. I scouted a bunch and was trying to figure out where that deer that I'd missed previously was at, and scouted over a couple ridges down, through a couple draws, and came up on this, on top of this like ridge near this lake, and blew a buck out. And I don't know what buck it was. I thought it was the buck that I had missed previously. It could have been the deer that I shot. I'm not sure. I set up that evening. A couple young bucks came in. I let it go in the morning, just because I wasn't confident I could get in there, particularly if he was on his way back to bed. I wasn't sure if I was going to be able to beat him or the does that he had been with back to bed. So I gave them kind of the morning to move and do what they were going to do. And then I slipped in right around, I don't know, I think it was like 11 o'clock, and then shot a buck at 3:30. Now, I don't know that it was him coming in, the deer that I shot, or if it was the buck that I had been chasing, but I bumped the buck out of there and ended up killing the buck the next day out of the same spot, which is why I'm not claiming it as a bump and dump. But, that was kind of my theory, or my approach was like, if there's deer in there, and cause I'd seen him there a couple times, I just couldn't get the right opportunity. I was like, if he's there, I'm going to just move him out of there, or whatever's in there out of there. And then I'm going to set up there, cause I think it's where I need to be. And that's how it played out. So I think to your point, I'm sorry, go ahead.
On that same topic, there is something I've done that's similar that has worked out for me very well.
Mm-hmm.
And, but you have to really know an area well. Mm-hmm. And, now I've gone into, like certain areas where I know all the bedding,
mm-hmm.
and there's a lot of transitional bedding, like on edges and stuff. And I'll walk an entire edge. Like one spot I'm thinking about is a round cattail marsh that has an island in it, but you got to go through like waist deep water to get to the island. And usually gun season. There's some guys out there, or a rut or something, but you usually don't get too much pressure there.
Right.
And it's got a good bedding point off the front of a good primary bedding area. And what I'll do is I'll walk the perimeter of that marsh, the edge, and you have bucks that bed on the transition line, and the bedding areas are there. You know where they're at, but they're not real good, and the odds of shooting one off one of those bedding areas are hard because they could be a 1 of 30 of them, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I'll just walk right through all those bedding areas. And then the next day, I'll go walk through all those bedding areas. And the next day, I'll walk through all those bedding areas. And then I'll go hunt that island. And without fail, that's paid off just about every time I do that.
Nice. So you're basically
So, I mean, you could force the deer into an area. I mean, they're not going to leave the...
Right. They're not going to leave the area. So you're just kind of soft bumping them to get them in a position where you can hunt them.
Yeah. And then don't hunt it the same day you push them, because a lot of times they'll just move height quick and just bed some birds random to height till darkness or whatever.
Right.
But the next day they're not going back to that same bed, so they go settle into one of their other bedding areas. And in that case, that's a really good bedding area. And it's kind of hit or miss. I mean, over the years, I probably had like a 1 in 5 odds of seeing a deer come out of it. But whenever I do that, where I bump it for 2 days and then go hunt it,
right,
I always see a nice buck there.
Nice. All right. So I think, Tim, are you okay on time? I know we're getting up on close to about an hour and a half. Do you have time for a couple more? Dan, are you all right?
I'm good.
You're good? You sure your raccoons don't need you?
They're all out by the windows looking in the house for me, but I think they're okay.
Nice. All right. So this fella here asks, I think just simply here what he's really looking for is, he's hunting an area that has often having some standing crops. And I ran into this actually last year. So this is selfishly, it's like I'm interested in the answer here. What is your approach whenever you have an area that is or can be good, or there's good deer in there, or whatever the case is, but maybe the corn hasn't come off, maybe it's been really wet, the early part of the year, and they can't get the tractors in there to take the corn off. How are you hunting areas where crops are standing a little longer than you'd like?
I actually like the corn standing. Mm-hmm. I mean, the only time it's a hindrance is if you're gun hunting over open fields, which I don't really do much. So for me, when corn's standing, I think the deer are a little more feel a little better about moving and along the edges. I think a lot of people think that deer bed into corn. I don't see that a lot. The only places I really see big bucks bedding in cornfields a lot is where cornfields have openings, like grassy openings in them, or a clump of trees in the cornfield, like an island, like you'd have in a swamp or something.
Right.
Because otherwise, they don't have the safety factors that they need. And a coyote could run down a corn row right up to them. Just one row over. They have to have some sort of safety features with the wind to the back and, a transition line. And so they don't bed in the corn as much as people think, but they feel a lot safer around it. And I do really well on the edges of corn if it doesn't get a lot of pressure. Mm-hmm. So corn being up, I actually like it. Okay. I think a lot of the bad thoughts on it are myths. I mean, you see deer go in and out of the corn a lot. Well, they're eating corn. They'll go in there and eat it during the day if they're bedding right on the edge of it and stuff too. So when they come out, I think a lot of people think they're bedding in there. But I really don't see mature bucks as much bedding in there as you do does or younger deer. Right. So I don't think it's a hindrance as much as what people make it out to be. You just don't see as many deer because you're not seeing them wandering around the field because there's corn in the way of seeing them.
Right. Right.
But they're there, and I think I don't think that the corn hinders you at all. I've done quite well in standing corn, hunting the edges of it.
Tim, what about you, man? Is this something you run into anywhere you're hunting, or is just like there's not much of that around where you're at in those big wood settings?
You got to drive probably a good hour or so to get to a cornfield from where I'm at. So I don't have a lot of experience. So hunting the farm, hunting the crops. Mm-hmm. But that hopefully that's going to change. In my mind, if I think I would, what I would do is first just find out where they're bedded. I mean, you know where your food source is, or a potential food source. Mm-hmm. Find where they're bedding and set up based on which way you think they're going to travel to that food source. Right. That's kind of like what I would think.
Right. Yeah, I think what I was running into last year a little bit, there was a standing cornfield that in the past, the year that I had a couple really good bucks in this swamp, and when I say swamp, it's about 25 acres. It's in suburbia, right? So there's houses around it and so forth. And the year that I had some really good bucks in there, it was a bean field. Last year, it was a cornfield, and I saw like nothing on trail cameras. I saw nothing,
Mm-hmm.
much for sign, but it was also a very wet year last year, and so the places where I knew where there had been beds were then underwater. So I think in that instance, because Dan, it does have, I had driven by it a couple different times to kind of get a visual of it this past winter and in early spring. Since the crops were off, I wanted to get a better visual of the field itself and how it laid out. And there are some of those like open grassy spots, and there's actually a couple like hedgerows in it that kind of divide up this field into
Mm-hmm.
kind of chunks or whatever. And so I think what ended up happening was that they got moved out of those beds that were on those swamp edges that I'd found, and that they ended up, getting displaced. And so some of those deer either displaced and took the next line of bedding, which then kicked those other deer that were using that next line of bedding into like the cornfield to bed in those, under those
Yep.
solo trees and stuff. And so I think that that's what was happening. So for me, I think after thinking about it, I think it was a couple things. I think it was the wet year, and the fact that there was standing corn, which gave them another bedding opportunity. So this year, I think it's back to beans. So I should hopefully be in business in that particular area. This next question is another one I'm interested in. So this fellow writes in and says, ground hunting thick bedding areas, when there are no trees to set up in, of course, he said, gave him problems last season. So do you have any tips for ground hunting some of these really, kind of thick, gnarly areas? Dan, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah.
Any approach that you'd like to
I
take?
try to get in trees, even if the trees are small.
Mm-hmm.
If possible, I think you get so much of an advantage from being elevated. But, ground hunting is hard. I mean, you just have to try your best to stay downhill for one thing, because the thermals are going to go downhill once it gets to the evening time.
Mm-hmm.
So trying to stay downhill, and trying to really get some good cover where you can see that deer before he can see you, and prepare, because if the deer is going to come out kind of by surprise because you're in thick cover, they'll bust you 9 out of 10 times. So
Right.
having where they're going to come from, and you're gonna get a clear view of them before they have a chance to see you, is huge.
Right.
Getting into a fallen tree or something, ghillie suit or something, they'll spot something out of place in their bedroom like you wouldn't believe.
Mm-hmm.
So you really got to be careful how you set up, and how you move and everything else. But it is tough, no doubt about it.
Right. Tim, are you, the big woods? Are you doing any ground hunting in some of those, thicker areas, in the big woods?
I don't make a point to go and hunt from the ground, but a lot of guys do it, and it's probably something I'll get into more as I learn my areas.
Mm-hmm.
I think what's really important is you got to know your area, pretty well. You got to know where the bedding areas are. It really helps if you have your Onyx up or whatever, so you can see your GPS, so you can see where you are and how far you are from things. One tip I think that might be overlooked is move slow when you're setting up.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's so easy to get into a rush, and we forget, that being noisy, and you can blow your hunt before it even starts.
Yeah.
Setting up, I mean, you gotta remember, you're hunting and you're out there to kill something. Well, you don't, if you ever see a predator, you never hear them, you see them, before anything. So I think, taking it slow and, being methodical about it, knowing where you're stepping each time.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's important. Watching where you're walking, and as you're in front of you, kind of see your route as you're going to step through.
Yeah, I think that's important. I think it's one of those things. Ground hunting is something I'm going to try a little bit more this year. One thing that I've done, in full transparency, to try to make it the
birds or the squirrels or whatever.
Yeah.
I think ground hunting it's just taking it slow is really important. I think can't really stress it enough.
Right. Yeah, I think one of the things I'm going to do to try to make it easier on myself as I'm adding ground hunting this year to a degree is I'm trying to focus on places where I know I'm going to have a ground setup, and I'm trying to kind of prep the setup just a little bit. You know what I mean? Or it's near like a scrape where I know is getting hit often, and so I'm setting myself up to where they're going to have something to distract them if they're coming in or whatever. You know what I mean? Or whatever the case is, just so I'm giving myself a fair chance because it's new, right? And so it's, I'm not going to think of all the things I need to do. It's like, drawing becomes a little bit different, right? Like whenever you're going to, do your draw cycle or whatever, making sure that maybe they're not looking or they're behind something or whatever the case is. So it's just a little bit more of a nuanced approach. I think I'm looking forward to trying it. But I think I'm going to have some bumps along the way. But, so this next question.
Yeah, I've killed a few off the ground. But you fail so much more than you succeed,
Yeah. That's what
your percentages go way down.
Yeah.
There's just some places you have to hunt off the ground. You don't like it or not.
Yeah. And what I've kind of found for me, it's like, I've looked at some places that I think would be good ground setups just because no one else is hunting them for that reason, because they're not able to get into a tree. And so they just kind of bypass it. And what I've found is that there's sign there. And so I'm like, you know what, I need to just kind of go for broke and try to see if I can make this work. Worst thing that can happen is that I screw it up and I'll learn something and I'll, hopefully do better the next time. But, because I think some of these places year over will be decent because they're just not getting a lot of pressure. They probably get driven during rifle season, but they're probably not getting touched much other than that is what I'm kind of seeing.
Yep.
So the next question is more related to late season here. This fella asks, do you think mature, public land bucks, are on food in late season, and is it reliable to follow the bed to food pattern, and cut them off during that time of year? So what are your thoughts on that, Dan, for late season? What's your approach to late season? Yeah.
Well, I mean, late season is probably one of the best times, if not the best time, to shoot a mature buck. Now, with that said, I've only shot in a few in late season, mainly because I'm usually tagged out.
Right. That's terrible news. That's terrible news that you're already tagged out. I'm just kidding.
But the years I haven't been tagged out, it's been some of the best hunting because it's kind of weird because you say that and some people probably raise an eyebrow because it's hit or miss. It kind of gets like Tim's hunting all year.
Right.
Where you're either in them or you're not.
Right.
You can go to a property and it's a ghost town, and the next property will have all the deer in the area. They're really food oriented. And if you wait and do your timing right, the really cold days, at least in the Northwoods, or the North Country, maybe you get down to southern states, it gets a little harder. But up here, if you start getting down to like 10 degrees or lower, those deer start coming out an hour or 2 hours before dark. And I'm talking the big ones too. Mm-hmm. And they'll go right to the food sources, and it gets a lot easier to kill them. And, late season can be pretty good. They get on a pattern where, your patterns in early season, as we talked earlier, mm-hmm. might be 4 or 5 days. You got to hit that 4 or 5 days right. In late season, they'll sit on a bed to food pattern until, the food's gone or something bumps them. Mm-hmm. So really the key for that late season for me has been not rushing in for the kill, sitting back, watching what's going on, scouting from a distance, binoculars, checking tracks, trail crossings on roads, circling areas, but watching food sources with binoculars, mm-hmm. and watching when you narrow in, watching the deer come in. Don't run in there just to hunt. You say, okay, there's all kinds of sign, I'm going to go in there and hunt. You really want to sit back and observe it first. See what the deer do, where they come from. Because a lot of times they'll come from someplace you don't expect. You think they're coming out of this wood lot, and you look and they pop out of a fence line. And you're like, oh, if I would have went in there and hunted that spot, he'd have busted me.
Right.
So now you know. And then a lot of times it's a hard approach, or harder than you think. You got to use the terrain. You got to crawl a little bit through an area where they could see you, and then you can get back up. And to get to a spot where they'll get to in daylight to shoot them. But late season has been really good for me in that regard. Mm-hmm. And they are very, very patternable in late season. It's probably the best time to pattern a mature buck.
Interesting. Tim, what about you, man? Up in the big woods, man. Are you seeing similar things, or is it a little bit different, given that the food sources are a little different?
It's it's different by us because during the late season, a lot of people who are around agriculture, the deer will herd up, and then for hunters, it's kind of like a feast or famine thing, right? Where you're either on them or you're not, right? You can see 30 deer in a field all together, but then you could check every other field, and there's not. It's like all the deer in a square mile herd up together. In the Northwoods, it's a little harder. They do herd up. It's a lot harder to hunt them though. The snow so deep by us.
Yeah.
If you're looking, by December, we might have, a foot to 2 feet of snow. So, I mean, you can track, I suppose, if it's during like muzzle loader or something. But as far as getting on them, yeah, they're, and one thing I think a lot of people don't understand by us is by Christmas, most of my bucks have already lost their horns.
Mm-hmm.
So, which is, and we honestly don't know why yet. I have a theory. I think it has a lot to do with the testosterone and the low buck density, where there's not that competition. Right. So they're getting ready for winter. So then they just drop their horns.
Right.
Yeah, I think that has to do with nutrition, because they're dropping them here too.
Yeah.
And you see it especially with the wounded ones or the stressed ones.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that definitely has a lot to do with it too, because there's not as much food up by us. It's a lot different. By the time it's late season, you got that woody browse, is what they're eating in the cedars. But down by Dan, it's feast or famine, really. It's like you're either on them or you're not. But if you're on them, then you can start coming up with a plan.
Right.
And you can sit back and you can observe and you can glass and you can kind of figure out what time they're coming out, where they're coming from, and try to, pick them off. But you also got to remember the deer are going to be a little more on edge. Mm-hmm. They've already been chased for a few months.
Yeah.
So they have a little more pressure. They feel that. So but their stomachs are driving them at that point.
Right. Yeah. I definitely struggle during late season. For me, it's like if I don't have the freezer filled by that point, I'm usually in bad shape. Because I've kind of run into what you both have said. It's like you're either on them or you're not. And just I've not. Plainly put, I've not.
Well, Tim's hunted by me, and we what we do is we cover a lot of ground. Mm-hmm. A lot of the places won't have deer. It'll be a desert, and we just keep checking spots until we find them. Get on them, and there's issues with it too, because a lot of times, maybe there's a spot like you said, you got to get on the ground, and now the first deer out are does, and there's 20 of them. They're going to come hang around you, and what are you going to do?
Right.
Something's going to spook, and I think of a hunt a couple years ago where I was onto some really huge bucks. I had this huge group of deer, with a large number of mature bucks in it. There's like 5 or 6 mature bucks and a whole bunch of other deer, and they were feeding in dogwood, and I was going in and trying killing them, and I was walking up a human trail, a hiking trail, and setting up off of that, and they were kind of putting up with my scent because of that, and I put a camera in there, and I have pictures of all these big bucks, and I got in there, and all them deer come in, and then I got multiple bucks around me and multiple big ones, and the target buck comes walking right underneath my tree. About he wasn't quite Boone Crockett. He was like mid 160s as a 10. Jeez. And he gets past me and he turns broadside and he's at 10 yards, quartering away and eating at the grass and stuff. So I get on him. I start pulling the bull back, and I just get the bull back to my ear, and 8-pointer off to my side blows and runs, and the buck that I'm aimed at, as I'm pulling the trigger, he runs, and it was like I could see it coming, but I was already committed. I was already touching off, and luckily I completely missed him. He ducked the arrow, but it gets tough when you got 50 sets of eyes around you. So, I mean, it's not as easy as I made it sound when I first mentioned it. Thinking back, I can think of all the problems I had trying to kill one. But getting on them is pretty easy.
Right.
Killing them is not in that situation.
Yeah, because at that point, it's like, because they're all yarded up and stuff, it's like, you're right. It's like, it's almost like hunting antelope at that point, where you have so many sets of eyeballs on you, or hunting, rutting bulls, you know what I mean? Elk, with their herd, with their harem around them and stuff like that. It's like, it's almost, becomes impossible.
And not a leaf in a tree, and you're trying to look like a stick.
Right. It's like,
and it's really cold, where everything is loud. Every movement you make, everything is just that much louder.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. So, all right. So that one we covered. So the reality is that there's some challenges. If you can find them, you can get on them. But there are some sets of challenges that kind of go with it that people need to be mindful of. So we got 3 more questions, and then we are wrapped. So this next question, this fella writes, I think simply put, what he's asking about here is hunting mornings in October. He's saying, for a guy that maybe has obligations, job or family or whatever, maybe the only time he can get out is during the morning, during early season. He's asking for a little help as far as like, what types of setups should he be looking for if he's going to hunt, a morning during the early season. So Dan, what's your thoughts on that, man? Are you a morning in October kind of person? Is it something you recommend, or if you were going to, how would you pull it off?
In the mornings in October, I try to hunt, either downwind of bedding, or I try to hunt back far enough in the trail going to bedding that it's before they swing downwind, which is what I like to do the most, because that's the most predictable thing. Right. When they get to bedding, a lot of times they come in from downwind in the morning because they want to smell the bedding area. So a lot of guys want to set up right over the top of a bed that's hard. Although Joe pulled it off last year on video.
Yeah, he did.
I don't know if you saw that. Yeah, that was a good video.
Yeah.
But it's really hard to do. And he had a unique situation where his wind was going over an open field, and the deer didn't want to circle the open field, so it circled right up against the fence where he was at, going to the bedding.
Right.
And so it's a tough nut, but I mean, you're not going to kill one sitting on the couch wishing you could hunt in the evening.
Right.
If that's what you have to hunt, go out and do it. I mean, what's the worst thing can happen? You enjoy a day in the woods,
Yep.
So it is tough to kill them in the morning in October.
Yeah.
Now, for me, I mean, if you can pick and choose your days, and one of your issues might be the old lady wants some me and you time.
Right.
Where you got to go out and hold hands and take it to the fair or something.
Right.
You might want to plan that in early October, because about mid-October, things start changing and mornings start getting a lot better. I start doing really good with my morning hunts around October 15th is when I start seeing a lot more success on my morning hunts. I mean, I think it still probably ain't as good as evenings, but it starts picking up pretty good. So, I mean, I wouldn't burn out if I can hunt that time frame, I wouldn't burn out my best spots in the morning before that time frame.
Right.
You can also get into an area where there's something going on, like in early October, a lot of things happen. Like they might have a youth deer season, they might have a pheasant hunt, something like that, and you can get into an area, and when they kick deer around, they're going to come into those bedding areas all day long.
Right. So Tim, what about you, man? Are you you hunting mornings in October? If so, what's your approach to it?
If it's early October, I usually save a lot of my hunts for the afternoon. That's just situational where I got, stuff to do, or I'm working, I just don't have a lot of opportunity to hunt in the morning. If a guy, that's his only time to hunt, then I'm hunting, I'm going,
Right.
But like Dan said, mid-October, you're gonna, there's gonna be some more day movement. The scrapes will start opening up by me, and for me, I could plan on some like all day sits, like October 20th, last 10 days of October, those all day sits might actually pan out for me.
Right.
I have a lot of daylight movement along scrape lines of those perennial scrapes, mature deer were coming out at, between 8 o'clock in the morning and 11. So, I mean, you can easily get in there way before and get set up on them, which is huge, knowing that they come in that time of day. And I've seen that pretty consistent in the last, 4 or 5 years in my trail cameras.
Mm-hmm. Tim, I wanted to say, when I used to hunt the Northwoods a lot when I was younger, I noticed something different from up there to down here. I noticed a lot more early morning and even midday movement up there, even outside of rut frame. And I always wondered if that was probably because of the predators or something at night. Maybe they move more during the day. But I did notice a definite difference between northern Wisconsin and southern Wisconsin as far as daytime morning movement. So some of that could be regional.
Right. Oh yeah, absolutely. If it's, in the southern part of the states, when there's more pressure, it might be a lot different. The northern, and I mean, we could just say big woods, or we could say like the northern, like the UP or northern Minnesota or Wisconsin. That there's something to that where those mature bucks will it's not like they're wandering around, but they're a little more comfortable, walking in the daylight. There's fewer of them, so but if you're out, the more time in the stand, the better chance you have of one, coming up on you. I think in a lot of people think about the best time to hunt is in November, which a lot of it is. But I think they're missing out on that. Like the last 2 weeks of October are some of the best hunting of the year, because those bucks are ramping up and they're getting ready. They're getting ready to chase those does. So they're stretching their legs. They're expanding their territories.
Yeah, I honestly like that last 2 weeks of October more than I like the first 2 weeks of November. They're frisky enough that they're moving pretty good, but they're not running around crazy. I mean, you can still pattern them. You can a good hunter with a smart head on his shoulders can still get on deer and pattern them and not rely on luck.
Right. So that's actually the perfect transition, because this next question is basically asking, what is, the Dan Infalt approach to hunting the rut? Like if you were to give someone advice on how to successfully hunt the rut, what would your advice be, or what would your approach be?
I'm not really too big on big funnels that are a ways away from bedding. Mm-hmm. I like little tiny funnels where buck bedding is close to doe bedding, and getting in between them, I think you see more mature bucks. I like walking around and finding fresh sign in mid to late October and setting up on it, because that's another thing is like I said about those deer being more patternable in late October than in November. There's usually good rut sign. I mean, you'll see good rub lines where they're moving a lot if they're an aggressive animal, and they'll tell where they're moving, and then if you can relate that to bedding, you can do pretty good. But for rut, I mean, when I do all day hunts, I like to start out the mornings near bedding, and then after sunrise, I like to get up and sit a funnel between bedding and doe bedding, because I think they get up later morning and they go check on does, but they won't move far through open areas if they're mature. Right. So that's why I'm saying those tight little funnels and stuff that are not as noticeable as what everybody else is hunting.
Right.
And then later afternoon, I kind of relate back to food sources and parallel trails where the bucks will be checking on does to see if they're hot. Like they'll parallel fields and stuff, and so I usually shift about 3 times a day,
okay,
and scout around a little bit, and I do fairly well doing that. But I don't camp out in one spot all day. I think there's reasons deer move in different areas at different times, and I try to use my head about where they're moving and why, and move with them, rather than sitting in a stand all day where they come through at 11.
Right. If they're
I'd
going to
rather
come
be
to
there at 11.
Right. Right. Yeah. I was just going to say, it's like be there when they're going to be there, not, waiting and hoping that they're going to be there all day. So yeah, that makes
Mm-hmm.
sense. Tim, what about you, man? What's your approach for hunting the rut in the big woods?
I think it's important to know your does and where your doe bedding areas are. I think that's probably the most important part of maybe big woods, is because I mean there isn't a lot of deer, so I mean like where like an area of 6 does, even just 6 does, that's huge. But you can be either on them or you're not. So the rut can be kind of like cyclical, where it will move through the woods. Like the rut's just going like certain areas, and sometimes it's good to camp out. I kind of go back and forth as far as all day sits or moving around. I grew up sitting all day long. That's how I was trained, I guess. When I was younger, just rifle hunting, bow hunting. Dad walks you in the stand, he sits you on a bucket or whatever, and then he says, I'm coming back later on. I'll come and get you.
Right.
All right. You sit there all day long. You don't wander around.
Yep.
So I still have that. I have that in me a lot, and I consider myself patient. But I think that, okay, something might still come around the corner, because I've had it for times where the rut will just, it'll just blow up on you, right? All of a sudden, like, boom, they're right there. And all of a sudden you got, chasing, you have these does running through. I've almost, like a couple of years ago, I actually had a snort wheeze at a buck who was chasing, and he snort wheezed back at me, and he circled downwind, and I almost got a shot at him, to the point where he caught my thermal, and then he kind of like stopped dead in his tracks, and then it was kind of, game was over at that point.
Right.
But the rut at that point, it stumbled right upon me at that night, which was, and I had been there, I don't know, 6 or 7 hours probably that day. I mean, that wasn't, I wasn't there all day, but yeah, you definitely got to move around though too. You can't just think, they're going to always come to you.
Right.
So you got to know your spots. And it's kind of a delicate situation where you make your decisions on where you're going to be. And when you make a decision to move, I'm always afraid, like when I start breaking down, I'm like, they're going to run up on me now. If it's 11 o'clock, I feel like I'm going to, you know what, if I leave, I'm never going to get them. Right.
Right.
But at the same time, it's like, well, what I'm doing isn't working either. So sometimes you just got to go and find them. You got to be a little more aggressive. You got to go out and go and get him. So yeah, it's a toss up. I mean, and really it's situational.
Yeah. No, I totally agree.
The rut's a fun time. The rut is a fun time to hunt in the woods, for big woods hunters sometimes. But it can be mostly miserable.
Yeah.
I mean, because you can spend like, I always think it only takes a minute, right? It only takes a minute. And they could be coming right around the corner, right? Yeah. That's hunting.
Yeah.
It only takes a minute. But
there's a lot of minutes. There's a lot of minutes in between that minute and the next. A lot of times.
Yeah, and it will test you. It will test your patience. I mean, some guys, they can't sit. I can sit. I can push myself, and I can weather through and beat myself up and drive myself crazy. But at the same time, I'll talk myself out of it and say, I got to get the heck out of here. I got to go somewhere else. I got to, this is not working.
Yeah, no, I know what you're saying. The one big woods piece that I hunt, I think I mentioned it to you when you and I were talking. It was the one year I hunted at 10 days. I saw 3 deer in 10 days. Yeah. And it's just par for the course. But it could have, in that area, I know there's big deer, and so it's like, any one of those 3 deer that I had seen, they were all bucks, could have been the biggest buck I've ever seen. You know what I mean? So it's like you just kind of put in your time. I think the other thing you hit on too, and I'd be curious, Dan, to see what your thoughts are on this. Like, I've learned to rely somewhat on trail cameras in those settings over time. And I think this goes back to the first question that we had of letting them kind of sit all year and getting some annual data and starting to learn like when certain sections of those woods are going to turn on based on the does that are bedded there. Yeah. Because we've kind of figured out, like, what we've learned in this piece is that there's going to be a lot of, and Dan, this is, things I think I picked up from you as well, but it's just kind of proven out in this particular area, is that on those ridge tops, like we'll see a lot of sign on those ridge tops, and there'll be, significant trails up there. And then when we get into really thick areas, because a lot of this area is clear cut, maybe on both sides of the ridge, and the only place they can really move is on the top, and there'll be doe beds like all along the top of that ridge, and so we'll hang a camera, and there will always be a handful of scrapes or a primary scrape area on those ridge tops, and we'll hang a camera there, and over the years, like what we've seen is like there's a small window of like 4 days during November and maybe 3 days during December when the does that haven't been bred come back in, that all the bucks in the area, in that general area, hit that scraper on that ridge top or in that general area, and that is it. I mean, literally, you can hang a camera there for the other 10 months out of the year and not get a single deer on it. But during those specific 6 days, based on when those does are going to come in, and what we've started to figure out was like we can start to learn what ridges or ridge systems, I should say, because they're usually a couple ridges kind of together that they're using, what ridge systems are turning on during what period of late October, early November, and then into December. So, have you guys kind of seen similar things like where you're kind of patterning not just specific deer, but when they're popping, when they're going to cycle?
Yeah. I've seen that in Wisconsin here, there's different peak ruts just in the different regions. Mm-hmm. Like where I'm at in southeast Wisconsin, I would say it really kind of peaks here around October 31st, right around Halloween. Mm-hmm. And when I get to western Wisconsin, it more peaks around like the 7th or so. Mm-hmm. Then when I'm hunted down in Iowa, it might even be like the 13th, 14th, 15th,
Yep.
You can almost stagger your hunts and hunt different areas to get the peak ruts. Yeah. But it seems like when you talk to somebody, they've got a locked-in thought on when rut is, and just generally everywhere. Like they want to plan their trip around rut, but really it varies from area to area, and it seems to repeat itself year after year. Yeah. As a matter of fact, I can think back of a doe that used to always come into estrus on a place I hunted where that doe lived in a certain area, and every year it would come into estrus early, and we'd get some real heavy rut activity in mid-October until some jackass shot the doe. But we had like 3 years of that,
Right.
And if that's what happens with that deer, I mean, that's you're going to turn your woods on. It's not as predictable as people make it out to be. Mm-hmm. I think the rut happens the same time every year, regardless of people saying that, it has to do with the moon phase or it has to do with this or that or whatever.
Right.
What the moon phase might do is put the rut during, more of the activity at night.
Right.
But they breed at the same time, and that's provable fact because of when the fawns are born.
Right.
Track it right back to the dates they were bred. Not only that, but if you look into how deer urine is made, mm-hmm. Do you know the process for that?
I do not.
The way that they get fresh doe and heat urine before rut, so that you have it for the rut, is they have does in captivity, and they've learned that when they go into estrus has to do with the amount of light in the day. Mm-hmm. So it's right down to the exact day that the light amount is a certain amount, and they do it in captivity by turning the lights on and off to that duration. Indoors.
Wow.
And they can get the does to come into heat 4 times a year just by the timing of turning the lights on and off.
Wow. Yeah.
So it has to do with the amount of light in the daytime. So it really happens at the exact time every year.
Right. Yeah. That makes sense.
But that time varies region to region, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, totally. Like, I totally get that. The one thing that I kind of picked up on, and I forget who I learned this from, it might have been Steve Bartilla, or it might have been one of the guys from the MSU Deer Lab, but does pass their in estrus date onto their doe fawns. And so since doe families live together like generation after generation, if you know where a doe family lives and they come in, and they cycle in, say on the 31st of October, those doe fawns, those offspring will also cycle in at the same time. So, that doe family or that doe bedding area, if it's still, if the same doe family is living in it, generation over generation, you should be able to kind of time that cycle period, within like a 2 to 3 day window is what they're saying. And it kind of going back to what you're saying, Dan, is like based on that light, like taking into account anything that might be different there, you'll have like a 2-ish day window that they'll come in at that same time. And that's what we've seen on trail cameras, like when we've run them, on these big wood settings of like things popping at specific dates, within like a 2-day window or whatever. You see the similar stuff in the big woods there, Tim?
Yeah. I mean, the trail cameras are important, and keeping an eye on them and for historic value, and hang on to them. Keep them in filed away in your computer or hard drive or whatever, because you're gonna see the same tendencies year after year.
Right.
Like Dan said, it's the daylight, and that's not gonna change.
Right.
When those, and your sign. I mean, if you just read your woods, the sign is going to start popping up at the same time of year in the same places that year after year,
Yep.
whether it's the same bucks or not. I mean, they learn from each other.
Yeah.
Those younger bucks are gonna as the hierarchy changes, those bucks are gonna rotate through the hierarchy.
Right. No, that makes sense. Kind of like these young bucks are learning from the old buck Infalt, right?
yeah, pretty much.
Awesome, guys. Well, hey, I know we've been on here for just about the 2-hour mark here, so I want to be sensitive to your time and give you some time in the evening back to spend some time with the family, the lady friends, or in Dan's case, maybe a couple of the raccoons that are hanging out at his house and might have to, since they're looking longingly in the window at him, waiting for his attention. But Dan, I appreciate you doing this entire series with me, man. This has been awesome. We'll have to figure out maybe something to do in the future again together. I know I've picked up a ton, have for years from you. I know I've gotten a lot of comments from folks that have been listening that have been picking up a lot of stuff and really enjoying the series that we've done. So I just want to say thank you again for everything you've done, not just for me, but for the hunting community and the information you put out there and how willing you are to share it. So always appreciate you, man.
Well, thanks.
You bet. And Tim, buddy, I appreciate you coming on. We're going to have to do a solo mission here at some point and dig into some more big wood stuff. We'll definitely have you back on for a follow-up if you're game.
Yeah, sounds like a plan.
Awesome, fellas. Well, thanks for joining, man. I appreciate you guys. All right, folks, that is a wrap for today's show. I'd like to thank all of you for listening. And if you haven't yet, please head over to iTunes and leave us a 5-star rating, and be sure to subscribe to the podcast. And hell, while you're at it, head over to YouTube and give us a sub there too. I'd be super appreciative if you do those few things for me. And before I shut this thing down, I need to give a big shout out to our partners who continue to help us make this podcast possible. Tethered, Exodus Outdoor Gear, Skull Brew Coffee Company, and Maven Optics. And until next time, we'll see y'all.